The great chamber of Nexus Prime had never known such fear, and the crystalline walls that had stood for 10,000 years now seemed to tremble with the weight of despair that filled the room. Ambassador Ketvaros of the Solani stood at the central platform, his thin avian body shaking as he looked out at the gathered representatives of 47 spacefaring species. And his golden feathers had lost their shine from weeks without proper rest. "We have lost another world," he announced, his voice breaking as the translation systems carried his words to every corner of the vast assembly hall. The chamber erupted in sounds of grief and terror, for each species expressed fear in their own way, and together they created a symphony of desperation that echoed off the ancient walls. The Galactic Concord had maintained peace across the stars for 10 millennia, and in all that time, they had never faced a threat like this one, never encountered an enemy that could not be reasoned with or understood. The Vethkai swarm had returned from the darkness between galaxies, and wherever they went, they left nothing but empty worlds and silence. High Chancellor Morthix of the Vallani raised one of his 4 arms to call for order, and slowly the chaos subsided into a tense quiet that felt even worse than the noise. "How many does this make now?" asked Representative Zell of the Korthan Collective, her blue skin pale with worry. 17 worlds in the past cycle alone, Ketvaros answered, and he could barely speak the words without his voice failing him completely. 17 worlds meant billions of lives, entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, now reduced to nothing but dust and memories. The swarm did not negotiate, did not communicate, did not stop, and every fleet sent against them had been destroyed within hours of engagement. "Our combined military forces have proven insufficient." Fleet Admiral Torvax, a massive being from a heavy-gravity world who had never known defeat until now. "We have lost 60% of our ships, and our soldiers cannot endure the prolonged combat that fighting the swarm requires." This was the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud, the shameful secret that the Concord had tried to ignore for too long. The species of the Galactic Concord had evolved on peaceful worlds, garden planets with stable climates and gentle conditions, and they had built their civilization on cooperation and harmony rather than conflict. Their soldiers were trained for peacekeeping and defensive operations, not for the brutal, endless warfare that the swarm demanded. After 6 hours of combat, their troops would begin to break down, their bodies failing from stress and exhaustion, and the swarm simply never stopped coming. "Then what do you suggest we do?" demanded Counselor Yith of the Nethrani, her voice sharp with fear disguised as anger. "Shall we simply wait for the swarm to consume us all?" The chamber fell silent again, for no one had an answer, and the weight of extinction pressed down upon them all. It was then that a small voice spoke from the back of the chamber, belonging to Archivist Quellos, an ancient member of the Memoria species whose people dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. "There may be one option we have not considered," he said, his words slow and careful as he moved forward on his aged legs. "Speak then," commanded the High Chancellor, desperation clear in his usually calm voice. Quellos activated a holographic display that showed a star map of the galaxy, and he zoomed in on a region near the outer rim that was marked with red warning symbols. 10,000 years ago, when the Concord was still young, our explorers discovered a star system containing a world unlike any other, he began. The image shifted to show a blue and green planet, beautiful from a distance, but covered in swirling storm systems and marked by violent geological activity. The planet was designated Terra, though its inhabitants call it Earth, and after initial surveys, our ancestors classified it as a Class 12 Deathworld. Gasps filled the chamber, for most species had never heard that classification spoken aloud, and those who had knew it only from horror stories. "Class 12? whispered Representative Zell. I did not know such a rating existed. It is the highest classification possible, Quellos confirmed. A world so hostile to life that survival there should be impossible, and yet something did survive. He changed the display again, to show images that made several delegates look away in revulsion and fear. The planet Earth was a nightmare made real, a world where the ground itself would shake and split open without warning, where mountains of fire would erupt and cover entire regions in molten rock. Weather systems were violent beyond imagination, with storms that could flatten cities and temperature swings that ranged from deadly cold to burning heat. The water was filled with predators, the land crawled with venomous creatures, and even the smallest life forms carried diseases that could kill in days. Our ancestors observed the dominant species from orbit, Quellos continued. They called themselves humans, and what we saw terrified the expedition so completely that they recommended immediate quarantine. What could be so terrible about a primitive species? Asked Fleet Admiral Torvax. Quellos pulled up footage that was 10,000 years old, showing the humans of ancient Earth engaged in their daily lives. The delegates watched as these strange bipedal creatures hunted animals many times their size, not with superior weapons or technology, but by simply following them for days until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, into freezing water and walking through burning deserts, adapting to conditions that would kill any Concord species in hours. They saw humans fighting each other with brutal efficiency, their bodies designed for violence in ways that seemed almost purposeful. They are persistence predators, Quellos explained. Their bodies do not stop, do not tire, do not break the way ours do, and their minds are capable of something our psychologists could not explain. What is that? Kethvaros asked, his voice barely a whisper. They can ignore pain, suppress fear, and continue functioning even when their bodies are damaged beyond what should be survivable. And they seem to actively seek out danger for reasons we could not understand. The chamber was completely silent now, every delegate staring at the images of these impossible creatures. Our ancestors erected warning beacons around their system and declared it forbidden space, Quellos said. They hoped that by the time the humans developed spaceflight, they would have destroyed themselves. For surely no species so violent could survive. But they did not destroy themselves, the High Chancellor said, understanding dawning in his eyes. No, Quellos confirmed. Our long-range sensors indicate that they have achieved interstellar capability and have begun colonizing nearby systems, and they have done so with remarkable speed. You are suggesting we contact them, Counselor Yith said, horror clear in her voice. You want to unleash Deathworld predators upon the galaxy? I am suggesting that we have no other choice, Quellos replied, his ancient eyes filled with sadness. The swarm cannot be stopped by our forces, but perhaps it can be stopped by a species that was forged in conditions as brutal as anything the swarm can create. The debate that followed lasted for 3 full days, with representatives arguing and pleading and weeping as they faced an impossible decision. Contact the Deathworlders and risk bringing a new terror into their midst, or face the swarm alone and accept extinction. In the end, desperation won over fear. Ambassador Kethvaros was chosen to make the transmission, and he stood alone in the communications chamber as he prepared to reach out to a species his ancestors had feared so much they had tried to pretend it did not exist. To the inhabitants of the Sol system, he began, his voice trembling. We are the Galactic Concord, and we come to you in our darkest hour to ask for your help. For we face an enemy we cannot defeat alone, and if you do not answer, we will surely perish. He sent the message into the void and waited. For 7 days, there was nothing but silence, and many began to believe that the Deathworlders had ignored them, or perhaps had not even received the transmission. Then, on the 8th day, an answer came. It was short and simple, carried in a language that the Basbali translation systems struggled to process, for it contained concepts that had no equivalent in Concord speech. The message said only this: "We hear you, and we are coming." And across the galaxy, the Concord waited in terror and hope, as the Deathworlders of Earth prepared to answer their call. The ship that emerged from faster-than-light travel near Nexus Prime was unlike anything the Galactic Concord had ever seen, and the engineers who monitored its approach could not understand what they were looking at. Concord vessels were elegant things, built with smooth curves and efficient designs that minimized material usage while maximizing comfort and safety. This human ship was something else entirely, a brutal angular mass of metal and weapons that looked like it had been built by someone who expected to be attacked at any moment and wanted to be ready. "Are those weapons?" asked Technician Vel, his tentacles trembling as he studied the sensor readings. "They appear to be weapons, yes," his supervisor confirmed. "Many, many weapons." The ship bristled with guns and missile tubes and devices that the Concord systems could not even identify, and its hull was thick and heavily armored in ways that seemed almost paranoid. Why would anyone build a ship like that? Vel wondered aloud. The answer came when the human delegation finally docked and emerged into the greeting chamber, and every Concord member present felt their instincts screaming at them to run. Admiral Elena Vasquez walked at the front of the human group, and she moved like a predator, despite wearing what appeared to be formal diplomatic attire. She stood taller than most Concord species, her frame dense with muscle that came from evolving on a world with gravity much stronger than the galactic average. Her eyes scanned the room constantly, tracking movement and assessing threats, even though she was supposedly here as a guest. And when she smiled in greeting, the expression showed her teeth in a display that made several delegates step backward. "Thank you for receiving us," she said, her voice carrying easily across the chamber. "I am Admiral Elena Vasquez of the United Earth Fleet, and I bring greetings from humanity." Cast Varos stepped forward on shaking legs to perform the traditional welcome, though his body wanted nothing more than to fly away as fast as his wings could carry him. "We welcome you to Nexus Prime," he managed to say, "and we thank you for answering our call." The humans numbered only 12 in their delegation, but they seemed to fill the room with their presence, and the Concord members found themselves instinctively creating distance from these strange visitors. Over the following hours, the humans were given a full briefing on the swarm threat, and they listened with expressions that the Concord interpreters struggled to read. When the presentation ended, Admiral Vasquez asked questions that revealed a mind sharp and tactical, focused on details that the Concord military had not considered important. "You say your soldiers can only fight for 6 hours before exhaustion sets in," she said. "What happens after that?" "They require rest and medical attention," Fleet Admiral Torvax explained. "Extended combat causes severe physical and psychological damage." "After 6 hours?" one of the human officers asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Yes, 6 hours of combat is the maximum any Concord species can endure, without serious harm." The humans exchanged looks that the Concord delegates could not interpret, and Admiral Vasquez nodded slowly as if something had been confirmed. "I see," she said. "And your ships, they are designed primarily for speed and efficiency rather than sustained combat?" "We have never needed vessels designed for prolonged warfare," the High Chancellor admitted. "Our conflicts have always been resolved quickly, through negotiation or decisive single engagements." "That explains the fleet losses," Admiral Vasquez said quietly to her officers, before turning back to address the assembly. "We will help you," she announced, "but first you need to understand something about us. About where we come from, and why we are the way we are." She gestured to one of her aides, who activated a holographic display showing the planet Earth in all its terrible beauty. "Our world tried to kill us every single day of our existence," she began. "The ground shakes, and opens beneath our feet without warning. The mountains explode and cover the land in fire, and the weather shifts from deadly cold to burning heat faster than most species can adapt. The images showed storms that dwarfed anything the Concorde had recorded, earthquakes that swallowed cities, and volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. The water is filled with creatures that want to eat us. The land crawls with things that poison us with a single touch, and even the smallest forms of life carry diseases that can kill millions. She showed them microscopic images of bacteria and viruses, explaining how these invisible killers had shaped human history through plagues and pandemics. Our own bodies betray us constantly, she continued. We can choke on our food because the same tube carries both air and nourishment. Our spines are imperfect and cause us pain as we age, and our own immune systems can turn against us for no apparent reason. The Concorde delegates listened in growing horror as the humans described the world that had created them. You evolved under such conditions? Counselor Yith asked, disbelief clear in her voice. How did your species not go extinct? Admiral Vasquez smiled that unsettling smile again, the one that showed her teeth. We adapted, she said simply. We became tough because our world demanded toughness. We became clever because only the clever survived. And we became stubborn beyond all reason because giving up meant death. She pulled up data showing human physical capabilities, and the numbers made the Concorde scientists gasp. Humans could maintain activity for days without sleep, when necessary, their bodies producing chemicals that suppressed fatigue and pain. They could survive temperature ranges that would kill most species, could heal from injuries that should be fatal, and could continue fighting even when their bodies were severely damaged. We are what your people call persistence predators, Admiral Vasquez explained. On our world, we hunted by simply following our prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and we learned to never ever stop. This is why you build your ships with so many weapons and so much armor, Fleet Admiral Torvax realized. You expect everything to try to kill you. Because everything on our world did try to kill us, Admiral Vasquez confirmed. Paranoia is not a flaw when everything really is out to get you, and redundancy is not waste when a single point of failure means death. The briefing continued for many more hours, and by the end, the Concorde delegates had a new understanding of the species they had summoned. The humans were not monsters, though they had evolved under monstrous conditions. They were survivors, shaped by a cruel world into something harder and more durable than anything the gentle galaxy had produced. We have one condition for our assistance, Admiral Vasquez said, as the meeting drew to a close. Name it, the High Chancellor replied, dreading what price these dangerous beings might demand. When this war is over, we want a seat at your table, she said. No more quarantine zones, no more warning beacons, no more treating us like a disease to be avoided. You wish to join the Concorde? Kethvaros asked, surprised that this was their demand. We wish to be your equals, Admiral Vasquez replied. We have been alone in our corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years because your ancestors decided we were too frightening to acknowledge, and that isolation ends now. The Concorde debated briefly, but there was really no choice, for without the humans, they would all die anyway. Agreed, the High Chancellor said finally. Help us defeat the swarm, and humanity will be welcomed into the Galactic Concorde as full members. Admiral Vasquez extended her hand, a gesture the Concorde had learned was a human sign of agreement, and after a moment of hesitation, the High Chancellor reached out with one of his forearms to accept it. The human grip was strong, almost painfully so, but the Admiral was careful not to squeeze too hard. We will send for our fleets, she said. The swarm is about to learn what happens when it picks a fight with Deathworlders. As the human delegation departed to make their preparations, Ambassador Kethvaros stood beside the High Chancellor and watched them go. Do you think we have made the right choice? He asked quietly. I do not know, the High Chancellor admitted. We have invited wolves to guard our flocks, and I cannot say whether they will. protect us or devour us. At least wolves can be reasoned with, Kethvaros said. The swarm cannot. Let us hope you are right, the High Chancellor replied, for all our sakes. In the void between stars, human ships were already gathering, their crews eager and ready for the fight to come. They had spent 10,000 years alone, building and growing and waiting for something worthy of their attention. Now, at last, they had found it. The first major engagement between human forces and the Vethkai swarm occurred in the Falvor system, and the Concord observers who witnessed it would never forget what they saw. Commander Yeltis of the Solani had been assigned to observe and report on human combat capabilities, and he had expected to be horrified by what he witnessed. He had not expected to be so completely terrified. The swarm had arrived in overwhelming numbers, as they always did, a mass of organic ships that blotted out the stars and moved with the single-minded purpose of a hungry predator. The Concord fleet that had been defending the system was already retreating, their crews exhausted after only 8 hours of combat, and their ships damaged beyond effective function. Then the human fleet arrived, and everything changed. All ships, this is Admiral Chen, came the voice over the command frequency. Calm and steady despite the chaos of battle. Standard engagement protocols, weapons free. Let us show these bugs what Earth can do. The human ships surged forward into the swarm formation, and Commander Yeltis watched in disbelief as they did something no Concord tactician would ever consider. They charged directly into the thickest concentration of enemy vessels. "What are they doing?" he demanded. "That is suicide." But it was not suicide, he realized moments later. It was something far more calculated and far more terrifying. The human ships were built for exactly this kind of close-quarters brutality, and their weapons tore through swarm vessels at point-blank range with devastating efficiency. Where Concord ships tried to maintain distance and use precision strikes, the humans embraced the chaos of close combat, weaving through enemy formations and destroying everything within reach. "They are enjoying this," Yeltis whispered, unable to believe what his sensors were telling him. Were filled with sounds he did not understand at first. Shouts and calls that seemed almost joyful, despite the destruction happening around them. "Did you see that shot?" one voice called out. "Focus on the big one to your left," another responded. "I have 3 on my tail. Little help here?" "On my way. Hold tight." They were treating this battle like a game, like something to be enjoyed rather than endured, and the realization made Commander Yeltis feel sick to his stomach. The battle raged for hours, then days, and the humans showed no signs of stopping. When Concord crews would have collapsed from exhaustion, the human crews simply rotated shifts and kept fighting. When Concord ships would have retreated for repairs, the human vessels patched their damage on the fly and returned to combat. "How long have they been fighting now?" Yeltis asked his aide on the 3rd day. 72 hours continuous engagement, the aide replied, with no significant decrease in combat effectiveness. That should not be possible. But it was possible, because the humans were not like any species the galaxy had ever known. On the ground, the situation was even more impressive. The colony world of Falvor had been overrun by swarm ground forces, and the surviving colonists had been pushed back to a single fortified position in the mountains. The human 14th Infantry Battalion had been deployed to break the siege, and what they accomplished there would become legend. Sergeant Marcus Chen led his squad through terrain that the swarm considered impassable, climbing cliff faces in full combat gear, and crossing rivers of ice-cold water without hesitation. "Contact, 12 o'clock, approximately 200 hostiles," his point man reported. "Only 200? Chen replied with a grin. "I was hoping for a challenge." The squad engaged the enemy with brutal efficiency, designed for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. But it was not their technology that amazed the Concorde observers watching from orbit. It was their endurance. The humans fought for 18 straight hours without rest, pushing through the swarm lines with relentless determination. When one soldier was wounded, the others would patch them up on the spot and continue fighting. When their ammunition ran low, they would scavenge from fallen enemies or improvise weapons from whatever was available. "Why do they not retreat?" asked the Concorde general overseeing the operation. "They are outnumbered and exhausted. Any rational force would fall back." The human liaison officer smiled that unsettling smile that all humans seem to share. "We do not retreat," she said simply. "We advance in a different direction." The 14th Battalion reached the colonist position after 3 days of continuous fighting, having cut through swarm forces that outnumbered them 20-1. They had lost soldiers along the way, and they mourned their fallen. But they did not stop, did not break, did not give up. When the colonists saw human soldiers emerging from the smoke and chaos, they did not know whether to cheer or cower. "You came," the colony leader said, disbelief clear in her voice. "We sent the distress call 5 days ago, and you actually came." "That is what we do," Sergeant Chen replied. "We never leave anyone behind." The Concorde observers recorded everything, documenting human combat capabilities with growing amazement and fear. They noted how humans could function on minimal sleep, pushing through fatigue that would incapacitate any other species. They observed the strange chemical reactions in human blood during combat, the surge of what humans called adrenaline, that made them faster and stronger when threatened. They documented the psychological resilience that allowed humans to witness horror and death and somehow keep functioning. "On Earth, everything tries to kill you," Sergeant Chen explained when asked how his people could endure such conditions. "The weather, the animals, the plants, even our own bodies betray us eventually." He checked his weapon with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that should have claimed him days ago. "We are born knowing we are going to die," he continued. "We know from the moment we can understand anything that our lives will end, that everything we love will fade, that nothing lasts forever." "That is a terrible way to live," the observer said. "Maybe," Chen agreed, "but it also means we are not afraid of death the way you are, because we have always known it was coming." He looked out at the battlefield, where swarm creatures still prowled, waiting for their next chance to attack. "Death is not our enemy," he said quietly. "Giving up is our enemy. Things get hard. Surrendering when the odds are against us. That is what we fear more than dying." The Concorde observer did not understand, could not understand, but he recorded the words anyway. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated across every system where humans engaged the swarm. They fought with a ferocity that seemed almost joyful, threw themselves into danger without hesitation, and endured conditions that should have been impossible. The swarm began to adapt its tactics, trying to find ways to defeat these strange new enemies. But every adaptation was met with human innovation. When the swarm tried to overwhelm human positions with numbers, the humans dug in and held their ground until reinforcements arrived. When the swarm tried to cut off supply lines, the humans learned to live off the land and keep fighting anyway. When the swarm tried to target human commanders, the humans simply promoted new ones and continued the game. Attack. They do not behave according to any logical pattern, the swarm's analysis units reported back to the hive mind. They take actions that should result in their deaths and somehow survive. They suffer losses that should break their morale and instead fight harder. For the first time in its long existence spanning multiple galaxies, the Vethkai swarm began to experience something it had never felt before. It was not defeat, not yet, but it was something close. It was the beginning of doubt, and somewhere in the back of its vast collective consciousness, a new emotion was starting to form, an emotion it had consumed from 1,000 species, but never truly understood. The swarm was beginning to feel the first stirrings of fear. The Vethkai swarm had existed for longer than most galaxies had been forming stars, and in all that vast stretch of time, it had never encountered a problem it could not solve. It had consumed civilizations that spanned entire star clusters, absorbed species that had achieved what they believed was the peak of evolution, and grown stronger with each conquest. The swarm was not evil in any way that a human or Concord mind could understand, for it did not have morality or malice, only hunger and the drive to expand. It was life reduced to its most basic function, consuming and growing without end. But now, for the first time in its ancient existence, the swarm was facing something it could not simply overwhelm. The humans continued to fight, continued to adapt, continued to survive no matter what the swarm threw at them. The hive mind analyzed and reanalyzed every engagement, trying to find patterns that would explain how these small, soft creatures could be so impossibly resilient. They do not have superior technology, the analysis units concluded. Their weapons are effective, but not revolutionary. They do not have superior numbers, the tactical units added. We outnumber them by factors of thousands. Then why are we not winning? The central consciousness demanded of itself. The answer came slowly, assembled from countless observations across hundreds of battlefields. The humans were not winning because of what they had, but because of what they were. They were broken in ways the swarm could not comprehend, damaged by their world in ways that should have destroyed them, but instead made them stronger. And the swarm, for all its vast intelligence, could not understand beings who had learned to thrive on suffering. It was during this period of confusion that the humans unveiled their true weapon. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo had spent her entire career studying xenopsychology, understand how alien minds worked, and when she was assigned to analyze the swarm, she discovered something remarkable. The hive mind is not just a communication network, she explained to the military command. It is a shared consciousness, which means it experiences emotions collectively, even though it does not truly understand them. How does that help us? Admiral Vasquez asked. Every species the swarm has consumed, added to its collective knowledge, Okonkwo continued. It has absorbed fear from 1,000 civilizations, but it has never actually felt fear itself, because it has always been the predator, never the prey. She pulled up data showing the swarm's recent behavioral patterns, the small hesitations and tactical retreats that had never been observed before. We are making it nervous, she said. For the first time, the swarm is facing something that does not fit its understanding of how the universe works, and it does not know how to process. You want to make it more afraid, Admiral Vasquez realized, understanding dawning in her eyes. I want to break it, Okonkwo replied. I want to show it exactly what kind of species it decided to fight. The plan was audacious and unprecedented, a form of warfare that had never been attempted in galactic history. Human psychologists worked with communications specialists to create a massive data package containing the entirety of human historical experience. Not just facts and dates, but the emotional weight of everything humanity had endured. The transmission was prepared in secret, loaded onto specialized broadcast satellites that were positioned throughout swarm-controlled space. When everything was ready, Admiral Vasquez gave the order, "Show them who we are." The broadcast hit the swarm's collective consciousness like a physical blow, flooding its network with 10,000 years of human memory. Black Death, feeling the terror and despair as a third of humanity died from a disease they could not see or understand. It felt the hopelessness of the trenches in the First World War, millions of young men dying in mud and poison gas for reasons they did not fully comprehend. It witnessed the horror of the Second World War, the industrial scale of destruction, the concentration camps, the atomic fire that consumes 2 cities in an instant. The swarm experienced nuclear terror, The knowledge that humanity had created weapons capable of destroying their entire species, and had come within minutes of using them multiple times. It felt climate change, watching as humanity damaged their own world and nearly made it uninhabitable through their own actions. It experienced pandemic after pandemic, war after war, disaster after disaster, an endless parade of suffering that should have driven any species to extinction. And through it all, the swarm felt something it had never imagined possible. The humans had endured all of this, and they were still here. They had faced extinction countless times from enemies without and within, and they had survived every single one. Not because they were lucky, not because they were protected, but because they simply refused to die. The swarm reeled from the emotional impact, its vast consciousness struggling to process what it was experiencing. This cannot be accurate, the central mind insisted. No species could survive such conditions. But the memories were real, verified by the emotions that accompanied them, the genuine terror and grief and rage that humanity had felt throughout their history. And worse, far worse, was what came at the end of the transmission. After all the suffering, after all the death and destruction, the broadcast showed what humanity had done next. They rebuilt, they healed, they forgave, they continued. Watched in horrified fascination as humanity emerged from each catastrophe stronger than before. Watched as they turned their capacity for destruction into tools for creation. It saw them reach for the stars, not because space was safe, but because the challenge called to them. It saw them build civilizations, create art, love and laugh and dream, all while knowing that death and disaster could come for them at any moment. They are insane, the swarm concluded. They are completely broken. But that was not quite right either, the swarm realized. Humanity was not broken. Humanity was forged. Every disaster had been a hammer blow that shaped them. Every catastrophe a fire that tempered them. And they had emerged from 10,000 years of suffering as something the universe had never seen before. A species that was not afraid of death, because they had already faced it 1,000,000 times. A species that could not be defeated by horror, because they had already survived it, had grown up surrounded by it. A species that the swarm could never, ever outlast. The hive mind experienced true fear for the first time in its endless existence, and the sensation was overwhelming. It was not the fear of a single organism facing a predator, but the collective terror of billions of connected minds, all realizing at once that they had made a terrible mistake. Retreat, the central consciousness ordered, something it had never commanded in all its history. All units retreat. We must escape. We cannot win this fight. The swarm began to pull back from Concord space, its forces disengaging from battles across hundreds of systems. The humans pursued for a time, driving them farther and farther from the worlds they had threatened. But Admiral Vasquez eventually ordered the chase to stop. "Let them go," she said. "They will spread the word." "Spread what word?" Tethvaros asked, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Witnessing, that some prey fights back," Vasquez replied, "and that some fights are not worth winning." The swarm fled beyond the galactic rim, broadcasting a warning to any other parts of its vast consciousness that might be thinking of entering this region of space. "Avoid the Deathworld species," the warning said. "They are broken in ways we cannot comprehend. They do not surrender, they do not break, they do not stop. They are not like us," the message concluded. "They are something worse. They are survivors." And across the darkness between galaxies, other predators heard the warning and decided to look elsewhere for easier prey. The war ended not with a final glorious battle, but with a silence that spread across the stars as the swarm retreated beyond the edges of the known galaxy. For the first time in generations, the species of the Galactic Concord could look up at the night sky without fear, could plan for futures they had not dared to imagine. But their relief was complicated by the presence of those who had saved them. The humans had kept their word, fighting alongside the Concorde until the threat was ended, and now they expected the Concorde to keep its promise in return. The ceremony to officially welcome humanity into the Galactic Concorde was held on Nexus Prime, in the same great chamber where Ambassador Ketvaros had first sent out the desperate plea for help. The crystalline walls now held new decorations, banners representing each of the 47 original member species, and one new banner that showed a blue and green planet against a field of stars. Elena Vasquez stood at the central platform where so many historic moments had occurred, and she looked out at the gathered representatives with an expression that was difficult to read. Some delegates still flinched when she moved, their instincts warning them that this predator should not be trusted. But others had learned to see past the fear to the being underneath. "We came when you called," she began, her voice carrying easily across the vast chamber. "You reached out to us in your darkest hour, and we answered." The chamber was silent, every being present listening intently to what the human would say. "I know that many of you still fear us," Vasquez continued. "You look at our history, our biology, our capacity for violence, and you wonder if you made a mistake by bringing us into your civilization." Ketvaros shifted uncomfortably, for he had wondered exactly that many times since the war began. "You called us from quarantine because you were desperate," Vasquez said. "You expected monsters, beings of pure violence who would destroy your enemy and then turn on you." She paused, looking around the chamber at the faces of species she had fought beside, species she had saved, species who still regarded her with suspicion. "And maybe we are monsters by your standards," she admitted. "We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day. We learned to fight before we learned almost anything else. And we have a capacity for destruction that even we do not fully understand." The honesty was unexpected, and many delegates leaned forward to hear what she would say next. "But destruction is not all we learned," Vasquez continued, her voice growing warmer. "On a death world, you cannot survive alone. The environment is too hostile, the predators too numerous, the challenges too great for any individual to face." She gestured to the human delegation behind her, soldiers and scientists and diplomats who had come to witness this historic moment. "We learned to work together, to trust each other, to sacrifice for the good of the group, because that was the only way any of us could survive." Vasquez stepped forward, moving closer to the gathered delegates, and her movement no longer seemed predatory, but purposeful. "We learned compassion," she said, "because on a world where death could come at any moment, we needed to know that others would care for our children if we fell. We learned cooperation, because building something that lasts requires more hands than any one person has. We learned love, because what is the point of surviving if you have nothing worth living for?" The chamber had grown very quiet, the delegates listening to words they had not expected to hear from the terrifying Deathworlders. "You look at our history and see the wars, the plagues, the disasters, and you wonder how we survived," Vasquez said. "Wrong. We survived because we helped each other, because when one group fell, another rose to continue, because we never stopped reaching out to lift each other up." She turned to face the High Chancellor directly, meeting his 4 eyes with her too. "We are not here to conquer you," she said firmly. "We have had enough of conquest. We know where that path leads, and we have no desire to walk it again. We are not here to dominate you," she continued. "We have learned that true strength comes from partnership, not subjugation. We are here because you asked for help, and helping is what we do." She extended her hand, that human gesture of friendship and agreement, and waited. The High Chancellor looked at her hand for a long moment, and the entire chamber held its breath. Then slowly, he reached out with one of his 4 arms and clasped her hand in his. "The Galactic Concorde welcomes humanity," he said formally. You are no longer outsiders to be feared, but partners to be cherished. The chamber erupted in a mixture of cheers and uncertain sounds, the delegates uncertain how to feel about this historic moment. But Ambassador Kethvaros, watching from his place among the Silani delegation, felt something he had not expected. Hope. In the months and years that followed, the integration of humanity into the Concord proceeded more smoothly than anyone had anticipated. Human engineers worked alongside Concord scientists to develop new technologies that combined the best of both approaches. Human soldiers trained Concord forces in combat techniques that could help them defend themselves without requiring human intervention. Human diplomats brought a unique perspective to negotiations, their experience with conflict making them surprisingly effective at finding peaceful solutions. The fear never completely went away, of course, for the Concord species had evolved over millions of years to recognize predators, and everything about humans triggered those ancient warnings. But gradually, slowly, the fear was joined by other emotions. Gratitude for being saved when extinction had seemed certain. Respect for warriors who had risked everything to protect those they had no obligation to help. And eventually, something that surprised everyone: affection. The first interspecies friendships between humans and Concord members were tentative and awkward, both sides unsure how to bridge the gap between their very different natures. But humans were nothing if not adaptable, and they learned to modify their behavior to put their new friends at ease. They learned not to smile with their teeth showing, learned to move more slowly and announce their presence, learned 1,000 small accommodations that made coexistence possible. And the Concord species learned too, learned that the predator instincts they had feared could also mean protection, learned that human intensity could be channeled into passionate advocacy for those they cared about. On Earth, veterans of the Swarm War returned to a world that had changed forever. They tended gardens that grew strange alien plants alongside familiar Earth species. They raised families that would grow up knowing the stars were open to them. They looked up at night skies that now held meaning, filled with worlds where friends and allies waited to welcome them. Sergeant Marcus Chen, who had led the rescue of the Thalvor colonists, became a farmer on his family's land in what had once been called California. He planted crops with hands that had once held weapons, and he found peace in the simple work of growing things. Sometimes at night, he would look up at the stars and remember the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the impossible things he had done. And sometimes, a Silani transport ship land in his field, and Ambassador Kethvaros would emerge to share a meal and trade stories with his unlikely human friend. "Do you ever miss it?" Kethvaros asked him once. "The fighting, the danger, the excitement?" Chen thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Part of me does," he admitted. "We are what our world made us, and Earth made us warriors." He looked out at his fields, at the crops growing strong and healthy in the warm California sun. "But Earth also made us dreamers," he said, "and farmers, and artists, and lovers, and parents, and friends. We are not just one thing," he continued. "We are everything our world forced us to become, and that includes the capacity to put down our weapons and build something beautiful." Kethvaros considered this, his golden feathers catching the light of the setting sun. "I think I am beginning to understand your species," he said finally. Chen laughed, a sound that no longer frightened the Silani ambassador. "Give it another 10,000 years," he said. "Even we do not understand ourselves most of the time." The two friends sat together as the sun set, human and alien, watching the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere out in the darkness, the swarm was still lurking, still warning others about the broken creatures who refused to die. And somewhere across the galaxy, children of 100 different species were growing up hearing stories of the Deathworld humans, the terrifying warriors who came when called and fought for those who could not fight for themselves. The stories would change over time, as stories always do, but the core truth would remain. When the galaxy had called out in desperation, humanity had answered, and the universe would never be quite the same again.